So now I get to introduce today's speakers. So Jess is a Georgia native. He's been really interested in falling in love with trees since he was 6 years old. I was so impressed to learn that he has nominated over 40 state champion trees. He has an MS in ecology from SUNY College in environmental science and forestry, and he's done research and advocacy. He's on the board of Georgia Forest Watch, and he currently serves at the City of Atlanta in the Office of Natural Resources, and he's helping with this inventory of ecosystems in our city parks. And then we've got Trees Atlanta's very own Michael Winks. He is the forest restoration coordinator. He's been working in this in 5 years. His background's in urban ecology, and he's also been a course coordinating forest restoration for 3 years. His experience includes restoration planting, volunteer coordination, invasive species removal, and project coordination across green spaces and conservation sites in Metro Atlanta. He's a graduate from Emory. He's an ISA certified arborist, and he is the 284th globally ranked intermediate minesweeper speed run record holder. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers.
Yeah, thanks for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to all of you for being here today. So, do any of you feel like you're a particularly good fit for your job? Not just in terms of like having the experience necessary, but do you feel like your interests or talents make you a very good fit? Um, yeah, see some hands going up. Um, and like, have you ever had the experience when you join a new job that other people with similar roles, you find out you have a lot in common with them, or maybe you've gone to a conference and you find people there that it seems like you already know them because you're similar to them. So, jobs sometimes kind of select for people with particular interests or talents. Same thing kind of happens with sports. So I know it's a cliche to have a photo of Michael Phelps in a tree talk, but I just wanted to get it out of the way early. Um, but he's actually a good example. So multiple gold medals in swimming. He's a good example of how athletes often have a body form adapted to their sport. So he's got extra large lung capacity. His arms are long for his height. His legs are short for his height. He is shaped more like a tadpole than you or I. So he's just got a higher ceiling for swimming than we do. But at 6'4", he wouldn't be a very good gymnast. So in the same way that people can be kind of naturally adapted to a job or a sport, trees also kind of have talents, or ecologists would call them traits. And those, adapt trees to living in certain situations. And, because of that, we often get trees with similar traits growing together. So we call those kind of repeated groupings of trees a forest community or forest type. I'm going to use those two terms pretty interchangeably, but it just means groups of tree species that tend to grow together. And what is causing different species to grow together is an adaptation to similar conditions. And, the traits that a tree might have are something like fast growth or flood tolerance or drought tolerance. And because they're adapted to the same thing, and those conditions don't just occur randomly, these groups of trees are going to be associated with specific locations on the land. So, a group of trees may be associated with a creekside area or with a hilltop area. You're going to get those same groups in those same positions over time. And, I don't want to kind of overpromise here. Forest types are kind of a human construct helping us, make sense out of the complexity that there is in nature. So it's not necessarily that you'll be able to go out into the woods and say, oh, the line is right here. It's one forest type on one side of the line. It's another forest type on the other side of the line. It's going to be more like there's one forest type on the base of the hill, a different one on the top of the hill, and then they kind of grade into each other because there is, you know, these adaptations aren't absolute. Different trees have a different mix, so you'll get some mixing along the way. But the underlying pattern is real, and that lets us make predictions. So when we see one tree species associated with a particular forest type, we can kind of predict that we may start seeing other species associated with the forest type. And the city of Atlanta right now is mapping forest types throughout all of our parks so that we can do things like figure out which species are kind of missing from particular forest types. So, if say someone like Trees Atlanta wanted to plant some trees in the park, we would know which species are going to be appropriate for which areas. So it can be a real management tool as well. So I'm going to go through our three kind of biggest forest types in the Atlanta area, cover a few kind of indicator species for each one, and then get into a couple complicating factors because this is ecology, so there are always complicating factors. And we'll start out with bottomland hardwood forest, sometimes also called alluvial forest. So these are the forests that you're going to find in the flat area adjacent to streams. And that's because the kind of controlling factor that's going to select for particular adaptations is flood tolerance. So these are all areas that flood at least occasionally. So the trees that grow in these areas are going to be those that can, take being deprived of oxygen to the roots for a few days without dying. These are also, moist areas with fairly nutrient-rich soils. So you tend to have species that are either fast-growing or shade-tolerant there. And, because you have a lot of saturated soils and shallow rooting conditions, some species adapt to this by buttressing to stabilize themselves as well. And indicator species here, sycamore, box elder, and I would have said green ash was a really good indicator species. But some of you are probably familiar with emerald ash borer. It's this insect that was introduced from Asia to North America around 2000. And ever since then, it has been munching its way through our ash trees. So right now, a lot of our bottomland hardwood forests have a lot of half-dead ash trees in them. So green ash is not going to be a very good indicator species for much longer. And in Atlanta, Morningside Nature Preserve has some really good examples of bottomland hardwoods in the floodplain of Peachtree Creek. Herbert Taylor also has some nice bottomland in the floodplain of Peachtree Creek and also its tributary Rock Creek. And on the south side of the city, North Camp Creek Nature Preserve is one of our less well-known nature preserves. It also has some really nice bottomland in the most accessible tract that's a little bit of a different species mix than what we have in those more northern preserves. So this is a picture from North Camp Creek of bottomland hardwood forest. So you can see it is completely hardwoods, and you can also see that it's quite flat. Does anyone recognize this species? Yeah, so I heard sycamore. That's right. So what tipped you off that sycamore? Yeah, really conspicuous, very light bark. And sycamore is really our only very large tree with white bark. So the bark's really going to set apart. I have seen people confuse it with river birch occasionally, which can grow in similar locations. It has, not as white, but pretty light bark. River birch, river birch bark tends to be a little more papery, coming off in horizontal peels versus sycamore when you get into the area where it's kind of transitioning to thicker bark, comes off more in chips and you get a little bit more of a camouflage pattern. But then on the base of the trunk, it can get brown and more furrowed. But if you look up in the canopy, you're going to see these nice white branches. It has other very distinctive characteristics too. The leaves tend to be three-lobed and kind of jagged, and they're quite large, anywhere from hand-sized up to dinner plate sized. And then they've also got these kind of leafy flanges at the base of the leaf. That is called a stipule. And lots of plants have stipules, but in most species, they're pretty small and inconspicuous and fall off pretty quickly after the leaf matures. But they're a little more persistent on sycamores and large in lobe. So that is also an unusual trait. And in the wintertime, if you didn't see the bark, you can look up and see the fruits hanging in the trees. They're these little quarter-sized spheres. Might get them confused with a sweet gum ball, but these are not particularly spiky. It's a more just spherical fruit that's going to disintegrate into a bunch of wind-dispersed seeds. Um, and if you're already familiar with all this, but say wanted to identify a sycamore sapling in the middle of winter, the twigs are also quite distinctive. The leaf base actually goes completely over the bud for the next year. So when the leaf falls off and leaves a scar, which happens when any leaf falls off a woody twig, the scar on sycamore will actually go all the way around the bud encircling it. And it's the only species in the Georgia Piedmont like that. So you can identify them from a twig in winter even. Our other kind of poster child for bottomland hardwoods is going to be box elder. Despite the name, box elder is actually a species of maple. So if you think of the Canadian flag with kind of a classic maple leaf on it, it's got lobes all originating from the same point. With box elder or its ancestors, those lobes got deeper and deeper until they fully divided the leaf. So in this photo, this is one leaf and this is one leaf. So there's just two leaves in that photo. So it's compound leaves, which is unusual but far from rare around here. There's more than a dozen species with compound leaves. One way to also narrow it down for box elder is the leaves always come in pairs. It has what are called opposite leaves. So a lot of species, or most species, the leaves kind of take turns going up the sides of the twigs versus box elder, they're always going to be paired, and the twigs are going to follow that arrangement too. So here's one twig on the opposite side of the stem. There's its partner. Come down here. Here's a twig, partner on the other side. Here's a twig. And in this case, the twigs died off as the stem's gotten relatively large, so you will kind of lose it over time. Um, but the leaves and the twigs are going to always start out paired. And there's a kind of handy mnemonic for remembering which species have opposite leaves. In this area, it's Mad Buckeye. Mad stands for maple, ash, dogwood, and then Buckeyes. And box elders are maple. The twigs are also kind of distinctive because they're bright green. Box elder is a very unusual species in that it grows in all 48 of the contiguous United States. If you go into California, the twigs will be hairy, but they'll be green kind of underneath the hairs. If you go to New York, there'll be this kind of white waxy covering on the twigs, but it'll still be green underneath. So pretty distinctive twigs, kind of classic maple seeds. Some people say maples aren't good for wildlife. I have watched squirrels just gorge on box elder seeds, so that's kind of hogwash. Um, the bark is a little less distinctive, but they do tend to have a lot of moss on them. And when folks were a few years ago doing the first lichen county by county lichen survey of Georgia, they told me that sometimes they would look at a box elder and they'd find multiple species of lichens that they hadn't found anywhere else in the county. Kind of unusual bark chemistry. So going back to North Camp Creek, the foreground tree is a sweet gum, which we'll deal with later. And then this tree is a box elder, this tree is a box elder, box elder, box elder, box elder. Pretty much all the particularly mossy trees in this photo. And box elder isn't a big tree, it's more of a mid-story tree, so it's going to branch lower and kind of be underneath the largest trees. And then if we move upslope from the bottomlands, the next forest type we run into is mesic forest. And mesic just means moist. So it occurs in the landscape positions that are moist. Places like ravines and north-facing slopes where the land itself creates shade and keeps things moister, or immediately adjacent to the floodplains and bottomland forest, that lower slope. And the key factor here is these areas don't flood, so wind is the primary disturbance. And that combination makes them really good places for spring wildflowers. Those spring wildflowers, they can't take, the shade and dry conditions. They need moist conditions. So these are our showiest areas in the spring. And one, non-tree plant that's a really good indicator for them is Christmas fern, our kind of native evergreen fern. It tends to be associated with music forest. Indicator species for trees, there's actually a bunch of them, but the ones that are quite common and relatively easy to identify are beech and northern red oak. And then I think really the best place to see music forest in Atlanta is the Outdoor Activity Center. There's a very large north-facing slope there with quite old forests on it. So it's kind of a big block of very mature music forest there. Lionel Hampton has some nice music forests. There's trails that follow the streams, and that bottom of the slope adjacent to the floodplain has them. And then Cascade Springs has some nice ravines with well-developed music forest in them. So here's the example from the Outdoor Activity Center. This is probably 50 feet elevation above the bottomland, which is farther than you'll get in most parks. But again, a nice mature example. And what species do we have here? Sure, some people will notice this, will recognize this one. Yep, this is our beech tree. So kind of paralleling sycamore, it's got very distinctive bark, but also has other distinctive characteristics. So, the giveaway with beech is really this smooth gray bark, and it will keep that smooth gray bark to larger sizes. Like a 4-foot diameter beech tree is still going to have very smooth bark on it. So that's kind of unusual. Some other species with smooth bark we have around here, some of our magnolias can have quite smooth bark. They have giant leaves, and in the wintertime, they have giant twigs that supported those giant leaves. They'll have like finger-thick twigs on them, versus beech is going to have more normal-sized twigs. Um, a young red maple can have smooth gray bark. It'll break up as it gets bigger. But again, maple, that mad buckeye for our opposite leaves trees. Beech trees have alternate leaves. So here we've got one leaf, there's the bud, but there's no other bud or leaf on the opposite side. It's taking turns along the twig. But these buds are quite distinctive for beech, a good wintertime feature. They are longer and pointer than any other buds in this area. I kind of think of them as looking like a javelin. And then the leaves, may seem rather nondescript at first. They're just kind of a typical oval shape with some teeth along the edge. That's not particularly unusual. But if we look closer, we've got the main vein, and then the secondary veins, very straight, very parallel to each other. And each secondary vein comes out to a tooth, and then the margin is smooth in between the teeth. So there's this kind of one-to-one relationship between the secondary veins and the tooth. So ironwood hop hornbeam is another species that can have smooth gray bark, tends to have a little more irregularly shaped trunk, not as round as a beech, but it will have a whole bunch more teeth along the leaf margin. It doesn't have that one-to-one secondary vein tooth. The fruits, not going to spend that much time on them, but they're quite distinctive as well. A little bit bigger than a pencil eraser, kind of little miniature burrs with two triangular seeds inside of them. And of course, in winter, small beech trees in particular really hang on to their leaves. We do have some other species that have this trait called mercescence. But beech are really the poster child for it, and combined with the other characteristics, really make beech trees unique. So our other indicator species for music forest is going to be a little bit trickier, because northern red oak has a bunch of close relatives in Atlanta. So we're going to have to combine multiple features rather than relying on any one feature to recognize it. Well, I like to start looking at it to narrow it down is the bark. The ridges of the bark have fairly smooth tops to them, or a light color, And then the furrows in between the ridges are much rougher and much darker. So you get this kind of streaked appearance. I've heard people say it looks like ski tracks. I kind of feel like in hot Atlanta, we need a better mnemonic for it than that. Um, but this streaky light and dark bark. And then the leaves overall are going to be kind of a typical oak leaf. It's got a bunch of lobes to it. And like the other red oaks, very pointed and jagged, and they have what are called bristle tips. A little bit hard to see in a scan, but the vein within the leaf actually extends beyond the leaf margin. And that's one way we can tell it is one of the red oaks. To distinguish it from the other red oaks, though, the leaves are quite shallowly lobed. So this sinus in between the lobes here, it goes less than halfway to the leaf midrib. And that's going to be somewhat unusual for our oaks around here. And also, the base of the leaf is rather wedge shaped. It's not flat going across. It's not a U shape. It's more of a wedge. And then the acorns, overall fairly typical for a red oak acorn. Northern red oak, or most of the red oaks, have a fairly flat, saucer-like acorn cap. I think of it as looking like a beret. Northern red oak acorns are a little bit bigger than most of our red oak acorns. They're thumbnail sized, somewhat variable. So no matter what the size of your thumbnail is, we can find a northern red oak acorn to fit. Um, and then just one more shot of the bark from a little bit different distance, a little bit different lighting, because I think that is a really helpful character. Um, and red oaks, you might confuse it with scarlet oak, also has streaky bark, but has much more deeply lobed leaves and fairly flat across the base. And it's in drier sites. Shumard oak is another one with fairly streaky bark, sometimes around here. It will grow right next to a northern red oak. It tends to have a little bit of buttressing to the base of the bark. Like if you see them side by side, you can see the difference. And again, very deeply lobed leaves and pretty flat across the base. So here is Mesic Forest from Cascade Springs Nature Preserve. We have our beech that's unfortunately been carved on a bunch. We have tulip tree, which we're going to get to later. And we have our streaky northern red oak. And we have an understory full of beech trees because beech are very shade tolerant. And then moving upslope again, we get into our oak, pine, hickory forest. So these are going to occupy, really a lot of the landscape, any place that's not very sheltered to retain moisture. And because they are in the parts of the landscape that dry out pretty quickly, they would have been historically had a lot of fires, not big conflagrations that burn the forest down. We're talking like knee-high flames that are basically just burning up old leaves. And not every year, but not going too many years between fires either. Um, so as you can imagine, not every species is going to like having fire come through. So our tree species in this area, their kind of talent is going to be in part resisting fire. That's often going to be having thick fire-resistant bark that insulates the living tissue or sprouting back very quickly if it's been killed back to the ground by fire. And because conditions are drier, not as many wildflowers, and slower growing. You know, and for indicator species, we're really going to focus on the oak part of the name. There would be pines in these communities, shortleaf pine in particular, but shortleaf pines really declined over time. So you really only see them as scattered individuals in the Atlanta area these days. And then hickories can be pretty common here, but our Mesic forests actually have quite a few hickories also, so they don't work as well as indicator species. And then in the Atlanta area, Lionel Hampton Nature Preserve, one of our kind of underappreciated nature preserves, I'd say, has really nice mature oak forests in the uplands. Cascade Springs Nature Preserves, if you just keep going uphill there, you'll run into some really nice oak, pine, hickory. And then Lake Charlotte, the soils are kind of funky at Lake Charlotte Nature Preserve. So a little different species mix, but a lot of nice oak, pine, hickory there. This is a shot from Spink Collins Nature Preserve, which has kind of a thinner rim of oak, pine, hickory. In this case, a lot of white oaks in it, but pretty typical oak pine hickory overall. And when I say focusing on the oaks in general, they're often going to be more than half of your canopy trees in oak pine hickory, but which particular oak species you can get can really vary. Scarlet oak, pretty well restricted to oak pine hickory, contrast with the northern red oak, flat leaf base, deep sinuses, and will turn scarlet in the fall. White oak with flaky, light colored bark sometimes can be really dominant in our oak pine hickory, but will also show up in our mesic forest. And then post oak, if you ever see a post oak, you're either in oak pine hickory or very close to it. But they tend to be more scattered individually. But all these oak species are often mixing together to dominate the oak pine hickory. The one of the oaks that's probably the best indicator because it is quite common the oak pine hickory, it will only occasionally show up in more mesic settings, is southern red oak. So the leaf in a lot of ways looks like a fairly typical red oak leaf, well-developed lobes to it. Again, bristle tips that are easier to see in person. But I want to call your attention to the base of the leaf. They are characteristically U-shaped. So on the photo on the right, that's about as narrow as that U will ever get. The photo on the left is a little more typical. Um, Also notice the shape of the lobes. They kind of curve out from the leaf. And that's actually where the Latin name comes from. Quercus falcata, falcata meaning falcon-like, in reference to a falcon's curved talons, curved lobes on the southern red oak. So at first glance, looks a lot like our other red oak leaves, but if you look for the details, it's really quite distinctive. And they're also quite distinctive on the bottom because the bottom of the leaf is pretty evenly covered in hairs, makes them a little more grayish. You can see it even on fallen leaves. Our other red oaks will have tufts of hairs in the vein axils, but southern red oak has hairs all across the entire bottom of the leaf. Bark, not as streaky as a lot of our red oaks. I think of it as a little bit more chunky. Acorns, pretty typical for our red oaks. These are a little bit bigger than a racer. You might confuse them with a southern red oak acorn or maybe a scarlet oak acorn. So really, I think the leaves, even the fallen leaves, are the most distinctive characteristic. And here's an image of that nice oak forest we have at Lionel Hampton Nature Preserve. Uh, White oak here, some southern red oaks in the background, another white oak over on the right. And then this other tree more in the foreground on the right is our elusive hickory, a mockernut hickory in this case. All right, let's see what we make of this image. So the trees here got white oaks, more white oaks over here. This is a little bit more in the foreground is a red oak, I think scarlet oak, another red oak here, red oak over on the left. So lots of red oaks in the overstory. And then what species do you see in the understory? Yeah, those persistent beech leaves, beech all over the understory. So we have oak dominated overstory, beeches in the understory. So is this oak pine hickory because of the oaks, or is it mesic forest because of the beeches? So this is kind of tricky, which is why we're talking about it. So this is actually oak pine hickory. When you're looking at identifying a forest type, you want to focus on the mature trees. So what did we say was the key disturbance that maintains oak pine hickory forest? Fire. Yeah. So wind was mesic. So that was one of them. But yeah, in the oak pine hickory, it's fire. And how much fire do you see on the landscapes these days? Yeah, not very much. Like sometimes we have a small fire every now and then, but not as a regular occurrence in any of these forests. And really, since about the mid 1930s, in general, people have been pretty effective at suppressing and not starting fires. So what has happened is kind of across the eastern US, our oak pine hickory forest now have an understory of shade tolerant mesic species. It was the fire that kept the shade tolerant mesic species down in those mesic areas, and they have just moved upslope out of them. So a lot of our oak pine hickory forests are very slowly transitioning to being a more mesic community. And we're kind of losing the oak pine hickory as a distinctive community and just getting more mesic forest overall. So yeah, this is a fire suppression effect. And then we have one other complication, which are areas that people have very intensely disturbed. So just referred to as disturbed forest or ruderal. Ruderal is just kind of a technical word for weedy. Um, and these are areas that were either farmed or graded in the past. And the real distinctive feature is that they have lost soil. So they've generally lost that organic rich topsoil, leaving the just mineral, the denser mineral soil behind, which is kind of a filter. Not every species can grow just on dense mineral soil. The other factor in these habitats is they were completely cleared at one point. Nothing's resprouting, full sunlight. So when they were colonized, when they were abandoned from the farming or grading, you know, it was whatever could come in by seed and then grow really fast because it's kind of a race for that sunlight. So we have characteristically fast-growing species in these areas. And for the Georgia Piedmont, that means loblolly pine, tulip tree, and sweet gum. All fast growing. The pines in particular do very well with kind of subsoil. Um, so often these disturbed forests will have over 90% of just these three species. So if you see, a forest heavily dominated by these three species, even if you don't see other signs of it, it was probably either farmed or graded in the past. So it can help kind of read the history of the landscape. And these are all over Atlanta. You can see them just driving around Atlanta. Spings Column Nature Preserve has some really nice mesic forests in addition to some nice oak hickory, but a lot of it was graded in the late 50s, early 60s, so it's come back in nearly pure loblolly pine. Falling Water Park, almost the entire park was farmed. Lionel Hampton Nature Preserve, really nice oak forest in the uplands. The floodplain of the creek, where the bottomland hardwoods would be, was almost entirely farmed. And here's a fairly typical shot from Morningside Nature Preserve. One side of the creek was farmed, the other side of the creek has nice bottomland hardwood. And this kind of messy foreground that brings up the sharing is a bunch of kudzu. These disturbed forests typically have a lot of invasive species in them. Loblolly pine, many of you know simply as pine, because it is 98 or 99% of the pines in the Atlanta area. But we do have a couple other species of pine here. Shortleaf pine and Virginia pine is sometimes planted, is further north in the Piedmont. Um, so just to have the characteristics of loblolly in case you see a pine that doesn't fit, which would be a more interesting pine, the needles come in bundles of three. So each of those has three needles. The needles are relatively long, usually in the 5 to 9 inch range. Shortleaf pine, as the name suggests, shorter needles, usually 4 inches or less. Virginia pine, even shorter needles, so don't trust the common names. Um, and shortleaf pine usually has needles in twos or threes. It can go either way. Virginia pine is twos, so if you see bundles of two, probably a different pine species. And then the cones are also bigger than the other pines. Loblolly pine cones are football shaped and baseball sized. Shortleaf pine is going to be like chicken egg sized or smaller. Virginia pine also smaller than an egg. So if you see a pine with kind of much smaller features, start paying attention. You may be looking at a shortleaf pine. And loblolly pine historically would have been mesic sites, some also in the bottomlands, particularly if they didn't flood for too long. And then on the hardwoods, we have tulip poplar, tulip tree, yellow poplar, take your pick. Gray furred bark, not super distinctive, but the leaves are really distinctive on the tulip poplars. And the thing to notice is it's a lobed leaf with an even number of lobes. Kind of worldwide, tulip tree and its close relatives and ginkgo are really about the only trees with an even number of lobes. Everything else, that vein goes all the way out to the end of the leaf, and you got a point of some sort at the end. Um, on young sprout, it might be 2 lobes. Sometimes you'll see kind of a start of 6 lobes, but it's always an even number of lobes. Flowers are fairly distinctive too. It's a nice big flower, a couple inches across. Come out a little later in spring after the leaves are all the way out. And the fallen flowers are actually important deer food. Deer eat a bunch of them in the spring. And then the fruits are quite distinctive also. It's this kind of pseudo cone with all these individual maple-like seeds that kind of gradually fall off, with a distinctive spike as well. And these are, um, tulip tree is typically going to be a major component of mesic forests, can get into the bottomlands a little bit too, particularly if it doesn't flood too much. And then last species we're going to go over is sweet gum. Furred gray bark, not super distinctive, really distinctive leaves. They tend to be 5-pointed, like you can find 3-pointed and 7-pointed ones, but usually 5, often with quite a triangular lobe to it. The one thing you might confuse these leaves with are some of the maple leaves because they're also palmately lobed. But again, the maples have opposite leaves. Sweet gum, like most species, is going to be alternate. The sweet gum balls are a great characteristic for winter. You can see them up in the trees. Again, much spikier than those sycamore balls. Start out closed and then open up to release the seeds. And then finally, the twigs sometimes will have very distinctive wings. I mentioned this because I see people confuse them with winged elm fairly often. Winged elm is named because the twigs often have wings on them. Sweet gum won't always do it, but it's not unusual. And sweet gums have thicker twigs and bigger buds than your winged elm with. Winged elm is a very fine twigged species, so that can be one way to separate those two. And then sweet gum historically would have been in the bottomlands primarily, with just a few individuals into the mesic forest, but now can be kind of all over the place. I want to wrap it up just by looking at how this all looks on the landscape, using Outdoor Activity Center as an example. And kind of the thing to notice here is we've got disturbed forest and other forest types all mixed together. It's a very patchy landscape overall. So, here's a photo from 1940. So the disturbed forest occupies all of the flat bottomland and portions of the slope as well. Really quite a bit of the site and mixed in with our more native forest communities. And things do correspond to the topography as well. Bottomland that's flat, entirely disturbed. The mesic area is on the north-facing slope, very broad, but on the south-facing slope, it's just kind of a skinny rim, and then going up this tributary, and the oak pine hickory forest on the drier south-facing slopes. So that's kind of a general background on the major forest types we have in Atlanta. And now we're going to hear a little bit about what we can do to take care of them.
After we take questions from the audience? Okay. Oh, there's another slide. Okay, cool. Sorry. Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely.
So awesome. So yeah, we put this together because every year Trees Atlanta does a really cool volunteer event called Conserve the 404 Forest, as you can see up there. And I have a list of all these things I want to say about it. So just to give you a breakdown, every year we do a different theme, or we try to. So in the first year, we were doing city council districts, which is a lot like Plantlanta, for those of you who are aware of our Plantlanta event, where we do a volunteer event in all 12 city council districts all throughout Atlanta. The year after that, we were celebrating parks in our different watersheds. So City of Atlanta has 9 different watersheds. And so we tried to do a project in each one of those. After that, we were celebrating community partners. So we were going to a lot of these parks where you have the most community buy-in, where a lot of the people come out, and we were celebrating those folks. And this year, our projects are going to be celebrating forest communities. So each of our projects is going to be a lot of the parks that he listed are on the list of parks we're going to be going to. And we're going to be doing invasive removal of invasive species. Everyone know what an invasive species is? Doesn't matter. I'm going to tell you anyway. So a lot of the stuff that he's talked about today, or all the stuff he talked about today, would be considered native species. And then there are non-native species, which aren't necessarily invasive, but any non-native species that grows to the detriment of native species would be considered invasive. That could be that they produce chemicals from their roots, which kill the roots of native trees, or maybe they just grow and outcompete our native ones and prevent them from growing and have a detrimental effect on our wildlife. So we're going out there to help remove those invasive species and help preserve the forest communities that we went over today. So the little breakdown of how the projects are going to go is you're going to do a little intro. We're going to identify a couple invasive species that we're going to remove out there. Most likely going to be Chinese privet or English ivy, for those of you who are aware, but you can learn when you go. And then we're going to do the removal. And then at the end, we're going to do a little tour where your volunteer leader is going to show you all these different species, give you a chance to engage with the forest community that you're in. So we're really excited about that, really excited for those of you, whether you're online or you're in the classroom, being a part of that. So, and you may also be thinking like, how outside of Conserve the 404 Forest can I get involved? How can I continue to learn and grow in my ability to identify different trees? Well, Trees Atlanta has a lot of resources that you can access. We have, I feel like we have volunteer projects every day at this point. Susan could probably confirm. I don't, there may have been a time when we didn't even have Monday projects, but I feel like if you ever want to get involved, you have the opportunity to learn anything almost every day of the week. Coming up on April 4th at 8 a.m., starting at 8 a.m. to 1 p.m., we have our native plant sale. So if you got inspired by seeing any of those trees that he put up there, you probably find something that will fall into a category of some of the forest communities. So if you identify that your neighborhood might have once been one of the forest communities listed, you can start buying species to go with that, which could be really fun. We also have our forest stewardship classes, which happen twice a year. You get a chance to go there and learn a lot. I know we have a couple people in this room who took that class. You get to learn a lot more about invasive species, a lot more about identifying native ones. And if you really want, you can start leading your own volunteer projects, which would be really cool. We also have our tree keepers courses. Learn a lot about keeping trees and identifying trees at those. Pruning classes, 101 and 102, and our city forest certification. So that's where you can get your yard certified by having a certain amount of native species in it. It's a really cool program that we do. You get little things called acorns, which are like points to like grading how good your yard is. It's really cool. Do we also have the resources page on here? All right, cool. And then there's also all these other online resources, books, and apps. There's a website sort of covers all of the different communities, but I want to draw your attention to like specifically the Piedmont section, which is where Atlanta is. It's called Natural Communities of Georgia. I have the link to their website right here, and this QR code will take you to a page where you can see all these resources as well. A resource I use a lot when I'm trying to really narrow down a species that I've found, especially in the fall when it's really hard to identify stuff, is the Vanderbilt Bioimages website. They have pictures of leaves and twigs and buds and seeds and basically anything, flowers. So anything you find when you're trying to identify a tree, you can take back to that resource and cross-check it. For any of you who are more interested in learning about mesophication, I've included a link. This is more for the Blue Ridge ecozones, but on the pages 5 to 17, they really go into the process and mechanism behind mesophication. And then our resources page, where you can learn about a lot about invasive species and planting techniques and pruning information. And then for those of you who like written material, there's a couple books you can read, which I don't think made it on here, but it's okay. There's one on the huh? Okay, cool. There we go. So yeah, a couple books you can read. Native Trees of North Georgia by the Georgia Forestry Commission. That's available on UGA's website for free. And then Eastern Trees Peterson Field Guide would be helpful as well if you just want to take something out in the field with you. And then apps that are helpful. iNaturalist, picture this. I would say that just using it to straight ID is not 100% accurate. Usually when you start getting those people who can like co-sign the ID that you assign to the tree and maybe narrow it down, that's more helpful. But they are really good at narrowing it down in the moment to trees you may otherwise be able to identify. I have had it do pretty good at identifying bark, especially with stuff like the northern red oak, which has very distinctive bark. But that's all I got for that. You want to do Q&A?
Right there. It out now. So there should be pencil in my speaker. Well, we have the questions. There also might be questions. Yeah, they're here.
You come on. Okay, the first question I think everyone wants answered is, when does the book come out? When are you going to write a book and a bio? You're a star now. Everyone wants to know you. All right, question one. Just mentioned that the city is mapping forest types across the metro. How is that being done? Remote sensing, field work, etc.?
Yeah, so it's going to be a combination of remote sensing and field work. So we kind of did a coarse mapping to just map our natural areas and separate out big structural categories. So forest versus vineland versus other low vegetation and power line right-of-ways. We kind of check those boundaries in the field. And then we're going back over those areas with several different types of information. So we've got historical area imagery to help separate out the disturbed forest. And then we are using topography. So we've got LiDAR-derived Earth surface. So the Earth surface within about 20 or 8-inch resolution. That's going to help us pull out the bottomland versus upland communities. And then we have some infrared imagery, which makes the conifers really stand out, which again can be helpful for pulling out the more disturbed areas. And then we also took some spring and fall satellite imagery. So right when vegetation is changing. So oaks tend to leaf out later than the mesic species, and they also tend to drop their leaves later than the mesic species. So using spring and fall imagery right when that transition is going on, that can help separate out the oak forest from other types of forest. And then we'll be doing plot work as well, and that plot work will be used to kind of refine things further, but it'll be remote sensing for that kind of initial look at the ecosystems.
Cool. I have heard that the Georgia Natural Communities website and textbook is the best resource that exists, but still isn't up to the current standards of the City of Atlanta arborists that approve planting projects in forests. Are you working on an updated list of city-approved species per plant communities to plant in Atlanta natural areas? When will this list be completed?
So kind of yes and no. That's not like a specific project we're working on right now. But we are going to be starting in just a few weeks doing vegetation inventories of all the park natural areas. And that is going to produce lists of species for each of these forest communities. And also, it'll produce kind of an assessment of which invasive species are most common, and we're doing additional invasive species sampling. So coming out of all of that, we should have a much better feel for which invasive species are actually the most invasive, and also which species are missing from different forest types, particularly for the disturbed areas, and that will inform planting recommendations down the line.
Okay, thank you so much. There's a question, and then I'm going to translate and give you an additional question on top of it. What are some examples of non-tree species for some of the communities? Translation, give me, for each of the three, give me 2 shrubs and 2 forbs, if you can. So we'll start with bottomland hardwood, if you can.
Yeah, bottomland hardwood, honestly, what comes to mind first are a bunch of invasive species. if you've got a real thicket of Chinese privet, you're probably in bottomland hardwood. It can be in the mesic forest as well, but it's going to get really dense in the bottomlands. And kind of similarly, Japanese stilt grass, it's kind of in all of our bottomlands, although it will go into uplands as well. One nice native forb for the bottomlands is butterweed. Pachyra glabella is the Latin on it. Comes up fairly early in the year. It'll get knee-high or taller, nice bright yellow flowers, and it is in the mustard family, so they're four-petaled flowers. Um, let's see, mesic forest. Pretty much all your spring ephemerals are good indicators. Trillium, ruinimne, bloodroot, those are all going to be mesic forest species. I also mentioned the Christmas fern, which is a nice one because it is there all year long. So it's really even easier to use than a lot of the trees are. Um, for shrubs, actually, spicebush is bottomland or mesic. A lot of their shrubs are kind of mesic, like um, sweet shrub, calycanthus. It'll be mostly mesic and maybe get a little bit into the oak hickory sometimes. Um, and then oak hickory dwarf pawpaw is a good one. We're actually missing a lot of our shrubs at this point. Like we have a lot of herbivory going on, and it's kind of suppressed a lot of our shrubs. Um, in a drier site, let's see, there's sessile oak grass, but that's actually pretty widespread. Um, you tend not to have as many wildflowers in the oak hickory forest because of that combination of shade and drier conditions. So, yeah, you might have a bunch of sessile oak grass, but not that many other forbs in them in general.
And can you re-clarify what herbivory is?
Herbivory is just plants eating vegetation, or sorry, animals eating vegetation. That would be kind of weird if plants were eating vegetation.
Okay. Thank you very much again for the question and for the answer. Um, this is a two-parter. Is there a public resource of Atlanta nature preserves?
So I believe we do have all the nature preserves up on our website. There's a natural areas office page within the DNR, or not DNR, DPR website. And then we're going to be publishing a lot of this information that we're just starting to collect. So there will be much more detailed information on the nature preserves coming out. It's just we have to collect it before we can share it.
Okay. And then part two, is there any way to identify the original forest type for my yard?
So kind of yes and no. Topography is a good clue to kind of narrow it down. You should be able to tell if it was originally been bottomland hardwood or mesic or oak hickory, oak pine hickory. Um, what I think we're going to do for more disturbed sites is we're going to use the characteristics of where we find the other communities where we exist, and then combine that with topography and maybe some other factors to predict what would have been there historically. So it's a modeling exercise rather than knowing historically, but we should be able to make pretty good predictions of what would have been there historically.
Okay. Shout out to Shelby. This question is from Shelby. Is it better to remove invasive trees such as mimosas, or is it more beneficial for carbon capture to leave mature invasives?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, because it pits these two needs of ours against each other. So I think what I'd say is, for the most part, our invasive species aren't that large, so they don't have that much carbon in them, slash removing them should release native species to grow a little bit faster. So, we need to not just, store carbon 50 years from now, we need it stored now. But I think our native species can recapture that carbon quite quickly, and we're not, in general, talking that much carbon stored in our invasive species. I think the one exception might be if you have a site that was like all invasive trees, where like if you remove all of them, you're removing a lot of carbon. And, if wildlife needed some habitat that trees provide, you'd be totally removing it from the site. So I think in some cases, the site can get so degraded and you're likely to just get more invasive species back there. If you've gone like, if it's far enough gone, it's kind of like putting a new roof on a house whose walls are falling apart. But that's kind of a corner case in general. I think you're really doing more ecological benefit involving removing the invasive species.
Here's another one, a toughie. Is mesification a good thing for the ecosystem, or is it more complex?
These are lots of good questions, and like this is a great group to have so many questions. Um, yeah, so the mesic species aren't bad. Sometimes people will talk about red maple, which is one across the eastern U.S., one of the main species that is involved in spreading out of mesic habitats into these oak habitats. I've heard people really demonize it. Like I said, I've heard people say, maples have no wildlife value, and this just isn't true. Um, but it is kind of an issue of balance and, is there some other place for these species that are being displaced? So in a lot of ways, the mesic species are kind of like a native invasive species where they're not bad. And if they're in the appropriate place, they're a good thing. Like, most of our invasive species are from Asia. They provide a lot of benefit in Asia. They just provide pretty little to negative benefit here. Um, it's the same thing with mesic species in that, they do provide benefit in their habitat and they will provide some benefit in uplands. The problem is, you know, oaks, like tons of wildlife eats acorns. It's not just squirrels, it's kind of everything. So you may have less wildlife overall if you lose your oaks. And there are dry site forbs, particularly if you've got kind of restored a little bit more open conditions. A lot of sunflowers, a lot of grass diversity, a lot of asters. And those species are now kind of restricted to roadsides, and there's not much potential of restoring them if we have this really dense shade layer underneath. And the oaks can't regenerate. So the problem is really these species that the mesic species are replacing on the uplands don't have any other place to live.
Those are great questions. Those were great answers. That was a great presentation. treesatlanta.org/40forests. Please come and have fun. Thank you.